Oxford in early May is not to be trusted. The wisteria blooms, yes, in careless curls over archways and ancient walls. But the scent is far too hopeful for a city that so often lies. I'd always suspected the flowers knew something we didn't. Their riotous growth across crumbling sandstone, their refusal to die properly. They were, in essence, theatrical. That morning, I sat in the garden of the Randolph, letting the Darjeeling lose its fight with the wind. The tea had cooled, and so had I, though I pretended otherwise with a paper folded too neatly to have been read. The tourists were doing what tourists do, mispronouncing things, misreading things, mistaking the dead for the picturesque. One American woman gestured toward the grave of Matthew Arnold and asked if he'd written that book with the vampire. Her husband nodded. Possibly. Probably. He moved to take a photo. The dead are very accommodating in that way. I was midway through a half-hearted attempt at the crossword when I heard the inevitable shuffle, the thick soles of Lewis's shoes approaching like guilt. He didn't sit. He stood, adjusting his coat, the way he always did when news had interrupted his lunch. I looked up, and he handed me a folded copy of the Oxford Times, already stained where the printer had bled. I pretended to care more about the clue I'd been stuck on. 11 down. One who observes without tears. 8, but I took the paper. It was buried on page 4, beneath a report on the county cricket scores and a poorly punctuated editorial about the decline of Latin in schools. Rupert Selwyn, it read, local historian and former lecturer in antiquities, passed away suddenly at his residence in Jericho. Private funeral held at St. Margaret's. No flowers. I said nothing, and Lewis misread my silence. It's just, there was a witness, one of the church staff, said the widow laughed. At the funeral. Still I said nothing. I read the notice again, slower this time, though the words hadn't changed. No mention of foul play, no coroner's note, no police presence, just a quiet man and a quiet death, followed by a quiet ceremony, until the widow laughed. Lewis tried again. We don't have to look into it. I just thought it was odd. You don't usually? I do, I said. Usually, you just don't notice when I do. He hesitated, waiting to be told more. I stood, abandoning the tea which had taken on the bitter clarity of regret. The crossword fluttered to the ground, and I let it go. I'd come back to it later. Perhaps the clue would mean more once I'd seen the widow. We walked together in the kind of silence that's almost companionable. I asked if he'd found anything else. Not much. Just that Selwyn was a member of the Bodleians Advisory Council. Used to teach at Magdalen before retiring. Specialized in medieval rites. Funerary practices, mostly. Apparently a bit of a recluse in his final years. No public lectures since 2009, and the widow? Julia Selwyn. Still listed as a fellow at Keble, in the classics department. Teaches Greek tragedy, I think. Bright, elegant, bit distant from what they say. I stopped walking. He saw it, the slight pause, and knew better than to ask. A widow laughing at her husband's funeral. Greek tragedy. The joke, perhaps, was older than either of us. We reached St. Margaret's just before the bell rang noon. The clouds, for once, had held back, and the ivy along the chapel walls trembled slightly in the wind. I looked at the pews through the cracked door, still faintly scented with lilies and old incense, the kind of place people go to forget or to forgive. She laughed, Lewis said again, as if saying it twice might make it truer. I looked once more at the obituary. The ink had smudged in the fold, but the name was still there. Rupert Selwyn, a man I'd never met, now dead. And his widow, somewhere behind that chapel door, already rewriting the memory. No flowers, I thought again. But someone had sent violets. Their petals were crushed beneath the weight of the service sheet, as though grief had pressed too hard. We knocked. The door opened, and Oxford, ever faithful to its performance, began its next act. The chapel stood as it always had, half forgotten, ivy-clad, smelling faintly of damp stone and secrets too old to name. There was something about the air in North Oxford. Still, tight, as though the past hung a little closer to the skin here. Even the birds moved differently, quieter, as if mindful of the scholars buried beneath their roots. She answered the door herself. That struck me first. No housekeeper, no assistant, just Julia Selwyn, pale-limbed, fine-boned, composed to the point of orchestration. Her dress was black, but not new, the sort worn by women who have rehearsed mourning in other forms. Her voice, when she greeted us, belonged to the theatre, not theatrical, but trained, precise, perfectly timed. She offered tea. We declined. The study smelled of bergamot and old paper. She had left the curtains open, and the light streamed in too politely to interrupt. There were books everywhere, as I'd expected: Euripides, Aeschylus, a bilingual edition of Aristophanes, and something else. A stillness. Not the stillness of grief. The stillness of rehearsal just after the audience has been seated. She gestured toward the armchairs. We sat. I asked the formal questions first. She answered in equally formal terms. Her husband had been unwell for years. Hypertension, stress. He had died peacefully in his sleep. No need for fuss. The funeral had been private by his request. Only a few colleagues, a distant cousin, and Isabel, their daughter. We hadn't spoken in some time, she added, brushing a loose strand of hair back into place. A shame, but not unusual. I said we had reason to follow up. A member of the church staff had mentioned, and here I hesitated just slightly, that she had laughed as the coffin was being lowered. She smiled at that, a tight smile, as if she'd heard a joke in poor taste. It was a smile, Inspector, not a laugh. A memory, perhaps, passed through me. These things happen. Grief is not always obedient. I nodded. I've seen stranger things. I asked what the memory was. She looked at me for the first time then, properly, not at my badge, not at the questions, but directly. Her eyes were grey, intelligent, worn. Something flinched behind them. He once told me, she said, that when he died, he wanted no Latin, no psalms, just silence, and a clean pair of socks. The man hated hymns. I think I smiled at that. It passed through me like breath through frost. Quickly, and then it was gone. A low creak drew my attention to the hearth. There, neatly placed beside a worn copy of the Bacchae, sat a pair of scuffed Oxford shoes, the kind that had once been black but now lived somewhere between brown and grey. Their laces were tied carefully, as if they were waiting. I asked when they had last been worn. She blinked. Not recently, I think. He liked his slippers in the end. I knelt, slowly, not for effect, but because my knees insisted on ceremony now. The shoes were warm to the touch. A radiator, perhaps, or something more recent. I stood. The Bacchae, I said, as if noting the weather. I've read it. He did too, I imagine. Oh, yes. He loved Euripides, found comfort in the inevitability of punishment. I watched her a moment longer, the way her fingers touched the edge of the tea tray, not lifting it, not offering it, simply resting there, as if something were being held back through sheer will. Lewis scribbled something in his notebook. I let the silence lengthen. It's in the silences that people return to themselves. As we made our way back through the corridor, narrow, lined with faded photographs of some excavation or another, I paused before a framed program from a Keeble production, Electra, 1991. Julia's name at the top in careful ink. I noted it, but said nothing. Outside, the sky had grown more serious. A robin startled from the garden wall, vanishing into the hedge like a secret that didn't want to be kept. Lewis looked at me sideways. "You believe her?" I didn't answer, but I kept thinking about the shoes, how they waited by the fire, how grief, when real, forgets things like laces, and how the Bacchae ends, not in catharsis, but in ruin. The Bodleian has a peculiar smell, not unpleasant, but ceremonial. Dust, vellum, the faint acid of aging glue. I've always found it comforting, in the same way I find the ticking of old clocks or the crack of cricket bats on distant fields comforting. They speak to a world that remains stubbornly indifferent to the small dramas of our lives. Lewis trailed behind me, eyeing the catalogue system like it might rearrange itself out of spite. I let him. Some buildings are not meant for certainty. Selwyn had once been a curator here. Not a glamorous post, but one of slow influence. The kind of role where a man can shape the past without anyone noticing until he's gone. The librarian, a woman of about 60 with the voice of someone who's forgotten how to be surprised, led us to the archives. There, behind a locked glass panel, was the photograph. Black and white, crinkled at the corners. The kind of image developed in dark rooms that smelled of vinegar and secrets. Selwyn stood at the center, hair thicker, mouth thinner. On either side, 2 colleagues, both now gone, and Professor Edwin Mallory, still breathing, regrettably. Mallory had the look of a man who believed in his own footnotes, robed, unsmiling, chin tilted to an angle that dared gravity to try anything. I studied the placement, Selwyn's hands clasped behind him, the others at their sides. A small thing, but perhaps not nothing. Lewis said something about the symmetry. I said nothing in return. The librarian handed over a folder of Selwyn's final lecture notes, yellowed at the edges. I opened them slowly, the way one handles a lover's final letter, out of habit more than hope. His handwriting was crisp, the kind of script that had once been taught with rulers and reprimands. He had been preparing a lecture on mourning rituals in the late medieval period. Pages of notes, some marginalia, a few diagrams, and one story, circled twice in dark ink. A 14th century account from Devon, a woman accused of witchcraft after laughing at her husband's funeral. The tale was brief, brutally so. She laughed, they said, as the coffin was lowered, claimed it was joy for his soul's release, claimed it was memory, claimed it was madness. They burned her anyway. Lewis leaned in, said it was just a curiosity, folklore, coincidence. I didn't answer. I've never much liked the word coincidence. It has the sourness of things left too long in the fridge. We found Mallory in the upper reading room, holding court over an exhausted postgraduate. He looked up as we approached, with the weary disdain of a man interrupted mid-soliloquy. Selwyn, he said, was a tiresome man, too fond of the obscure, always digging through footnotes for phantoms. His recent work, he added with a sigh, had descended into, and here he paused for effect, folkloric tedium. I asked if they had fallen out. He gave me a look I recognized, the kind that asked if I'd read King Lear properly. We disagreed, he said. He was sentimental. I am not, that's all. Lewis asked about the photograph. Mallory glanced at it and remarked it was a long time ago. The others were all dead, after all. Time had rendered the alliances irrelevant. It was his phrasing that caught me. The others, not Selwyn, not Rupert. The others. Outside, the rain had started again. Not in earnest, but with the careful rhythm of someone tapping their fingers on a desk, waiting. As we left, I ran my fingers once more along the edge of the photograph. There, just visible behind Selwyn's shoulder, was a shelf label. Manuscripts, ritual, and burial. And Selwyn's gaze, unreadable in monochrome, tilted ever so slightly to the left. Not at the camera, not at Mallory, but toward the shelves. I told Lewis to make a note. He asked of what. "Just in case," I said. He nodded, though I doubt he understood what we were keeping. I wasn't sure either. But something had shifted. Not enough to name, but enough to stay with me as the rain darkened the Bodleian steps and the wind, like some old chorus, whispered nothing useful at all. The school stood on the edge of Oxford like a thought half retracted. A red brick building with ivy that hadn't quite committed, and corridors that smelled of chalk, varnish, and the gentle tyranny of order. Girls in blazers moved through the grounds in quiet clutches, eyes forward, collars askew. The sort of place where futures are assembled piece by piece. Efficiently, delicately, sometimes without consent. Isabel Selwyn's classroom was on the second floor near the science labs. A curious placement. The hallway was empty when we arrived, save for the hum of fluorescent lights and the scuff of our own shoes against linoleum. Her door was slightly ajar, like a mouth that had begun a sentence it couldn't quite finish. She stood as we entered. Not out of politeness, I think, but instinct. Tall, deliberate, with a calmness that didn't invite comfort. Her eyes were not cold, exactly. They simply registered the temperature and decided not to react. We introduced ourselves. She didn't offer tea or apology or smile. Said she'd heard about her father from a colleague. Said the funeral had been brief. Said she had no intention of revisiting the past. She gestured to a pair of plastic chairs and resumed stacking worksheets into a neat pile. Page corners aligned with faint, obsessive precision. I glanced at the whiteboard, a diagram of plate tectonics. Beneath it, a quote in tidy lettering, "Geography is destiny." Lewis asked about her relationship with her father. Her hands stilled just for a moment before continuing. We hadn't spoken in 3 years. He made his choices. The words landed without drama, as though rehearsed or translated from a language she no longer spoke natively. I asked if she'd attended the service willingly. She shrugged, a small, brittle motion. He was my father. That doesn't expire. I watched her then as she moved behind the desk, adjusting a stack of textbooks that didn't need adjusting. Her fingers brushed a small bronze figure at the corner. A classical statuette, barely 5 inches tall. Sappho, by the look of it. Broken at the ankle. A hairline crack ran through the base, as if the past had stumbled and no one thought to mend it. She caught me looking. Said it was a gift from her mother, years ago. The way one might refer to an old wound, long since closed but still subject to weather. Lewis, ever earnest, asked if she missed her father. She smiled, but only with her mouth. Some absences grow more comfortable over time, like silence in an overfamiliar room. I asked about the book, the one buried with him. No idea. I wasn't told. His legacy was mostly paperwork. She said it with the faintest touch of irony, a gesture toward humor without the risk of laughter. I let the silence stretch. Sometimes it does the work better than questions. Eventually, she stood. "If you're finished, I have a lesson in 5 minutes." Volcanoes. Metaphors are inevitable. We thanked her. She didn't walk us out. Back in the corridor, Lewis muttered that it was odd. Her background, all that Greek and Latin. And here she was teaching continental drift. It is odd, I agreed. But I said nothing more. Because I was thinking of the statuette, the missing ankle, the way her fingers had hovered over it. Not caressing, not afraid, just remembering. The sort of memory that isn't shaped by time but by the moment it stopped. And I wondered if geography really was destiny, or if some landscapes, familial ones especially, resist mapping entirely. Some houses never quite shake the weight of their occupants. The Selwyn residence was one of those, too quiet in the wrong places, too composed in the right ones. A kind of curated stillness the sort that comes not from peace but from an insistence on control. Julia had stepped out. A departmental meeting at Keble, or so she claimed. I suspected she preferred to be absent while others rummaged through the traces of her grief. I didn't blame her. Lewis wandered the hall, scribbling into his notebook as though murder might emerge from a curtain seam. I left him to it. My own instinct was slower, quieter, less a hunt, more a listening. Some truths don't announce themselves. They hum faintly, just beneath the varnish. In the drawing room, everything was immaculate. Books arranged by author and spine color, not subject. A small rebellion, perhaps, or a vanity. On the sideboard, a glass decanter of sherry caught the last of the morning light. It glowed faintly amber, like a truth steeped in time. There were 2 glasses. One with a faint lipstick trace in coral, the other unmarked but not untouched. The level of liquid suggested use. Julia had said she and Rupert hadn't spoken the night before his death. Not even a shared drink, she had insisted. And yet here they were, twin vessels, one emptied more recently than the other. Behind the bureau I found it, folded twice and just crooked enough to suggest haste. A sheet of printed paper, an earlier obituary, shorter, colder. No mention of Julia, no poetic turn of phrase. No allusion to loss, just the bare facts of death, and a brief nod to Selwyn's academic postings. I read it twice. Then I folded it back the same way, placing it gently where I'd found it. Mrs. Jenks arrived with a flourish of bags and apologies. A woman in her 60s, perhaps 70s, depending on the lighting and her mood. She wore lavender, perfume and disapproval in equal measure. She offered the usual pleasantries. Said Rupert had always been kind, though distant. Said Julia had a mind like a scalpel, and just as warm. Then she paused, hands mid-fold over a cushion, and said something odd. I don't know why he insisted on being buried with that book. Gave me shivers, it did. I turned. Which book? She looked around, as if fearing the answer might overhear her. One of them Greek things. But in Latin. I asked if she'd seen the title. She shook her head. Just that he kept it wrapped in a cloth. Said it was for the journey. Thought he was joking. I wasn't sure. She went back to dusting. I stayed still, thoughts arranging themselves in strange constellations. A Greek book in Latin, a cloth wrapping, a journey. I'd seen something like that once, years ago. A burial rite from a fringe sect in Thessaly, obsessed with purification through language. The dead were given translated scrolls to guide them through Hades, half myth, half liturgy. I didn't tell Lewis that. He was in the study, photographing the fireplace tiles with more optimism than accuracy. I simply joined him, looked once more at the room's false serenity, and told him we were done here. For now. Outside, the clouds had begun to gather, not dramatically, just the slow thickening of sky that foretells a reluctant rain. Lewis asked if something had changed. I said I wasn't sure, but I kept thinking of the 2 glasses and the second obituary, and how some books are not for reading, but for burying, and how a lie, if poured carefully enough, leaves no residue at all. The solicitor's office overlooked a narrow lane where rain collected in ancient cobblestones like ink, pooling in the spine of a book no one wanted to finish. The brass plate on the door read, Penfield and Clark, though Clark had long since disappeared into retirement, and Penfield, by the look of him, had one foot in retirement's waiting room. He greeted us with a voice dry as archival paper and a handshake that suggested he hadn't been required to use it often. The room smelled of damp wool, varnish, and quiet postponements. A clock ticked slowly behind him. Not for timekeeping, I suspected, but for something more ceremonial, as if marking the long, cautious descent into legal death. Penfield gestured toward the chairs. I declined. I find solicitors' chairs make you forget things you were about to question. Lewis sat. He always does. We're not here to contest anything, I said. Just a few clarifications. Of course, said Penfield, unfolding a file with the reverence of a man accustomed to dealing in endings. The will was concise, like the man himself. The bulk of the estate, the house, the pension, the investments, all to Julia. No surprises, no theatrics, just a quiet statement of loyalty, or habit, hard to tell with the dead. Then came the bequest to Professor Edwin Mallory, a single manuscript, handwritten, annotated. Selwyn's life's work, apparently, on medieval rites of death and burial. Penfield called it an academic token. I called it something else. I didn't say it aloud. But it was the final clause that caught me. A request, not in Julia's handwriting, but in Selwyn's own, that a specific book of his choosing be buried with him. That's unusual, I said. Penfield nodded. Eccentric, perhaps, but not illegal. He added the clause about a month before his passing, brought it in himself, seemed very sure. I asked if he had seemed unwell. Penfield hesitated, which in solicitor terms is almost a confession. Not especially. Though he did seem preoccupied. And he quoted something from Seneca, I believe, as he signed. Something about choosing the hour of one's own curtain. Lewis shifted in his seat. Penfield continued folding papers as though time would forgive him if he made the edges meet precisely. The curtain. I said the word aloud, once, to hear its weight. I asked if the book had been identified. Penfield didn't know. He only arranged the burial, not the inventory of the dead man's mind. And Julia? She watched La Traviata that night, on DV, alone. It's always La Traviata, I said, almost to myself. Lewis raised an eyebrow. She told me, I added, at our first visit. He died quietly, she said, and she wept quietly, and the music played on, but it was all too tuned. I know La Traviata. I know where the silence should fall. We left Penfield with his clock and his documents and the soft click of certainty disguising itself as routine. Outside, the rain had grown confident. It gathered on the brim of my coat, in the folds of Lewis's notes, on the tips of trees that had no use for it. Men who plan their deaths do not die of surprise, nor do they ask to be buried with a book, unless the book means something more than comfort. Back at the station, I poured a whiskey I hadn't earned, hummed a few bars of Verdi, low and unsteady. She dies in the end, of course. Violetta. But it's not the death that lingers. It's the moments just before, the ones filled with the illusion of breath returning, of time reversing. And I wondered what Selwyn had been listening for, and whether Julia had heard it too. The Bodleian again, that particular grey of morning light filtering through leaded glass, thick with the dust of centuries. There's something about the way silence behaves in that building. Not passive, but curated. A kind of sacred hush, as if the walls are still listening to all they've been told and haven't quite decided what to believe. We requested Selwyn's academic materials, politely and with the kind of authority that has less to do with badges and more to do with being seen too often in the same overcoat. The librarian, bless her, had already anticipated our request. The copy of Diritto Sepulturae, on the rites of burial, was waiting, wrapped in cloth, a slip of paper nestled between its pages like a breath that had no time to exhale. I let Lewis unwrap it. The spine cracked gently, like an old man adjusting his posture. Latin, mostly. Marginalia, in 2 hands. One tidy, one fractured with age. Near the back, scrawled between 2 footnotes about the purification of the corpse, was the line that stopped me. A phrase in Greek, handwritten and inked more recently than the rest. Ο γελών τελευταίος επιλανθάνεται ελάχιστα. He who laughs last forgets least. I read it aloud. Lewis squinted, asked what it meant. I gave him the English, watching the shape of the words shift on his face. He said it sounded like a joke made to sting. I said it sounded rehearsed. Julia, of course, would know the line. Her doctoral thesis had been on the uses of laughter in Greek ritual, specifically mourning, the cruel ambivalence of joy at a funeral. Laughter, in her argument, was an act of refusal, a final disobedience in the face of fate. I closed the book slowly, my fingertips grazing the edge of the inscription. It felt, how did I put it, too aware, too elegant for spontaneity, like an epigraph carved by someone who wanted their grief to rhyme. I asked the librarian when this particular copy had last been handled. She consulted a ledger with the look of someone asked to relive a tedious childhood. 3 weeks ago. Rupert Selwyn. And before that, Julia, nearly a year prior. For reference, she'd said. I wondered aloud what she was referencing. No one answered. We took the copy back to the station for closer examination. The ink used in the inscription wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. Not Bodleian ink. A private pen, perhaps. The Greek was accurate. Classical, not coin. Formal, then. Meant to be read by someone who would understand the difference. Lewis returned from the records room holding a piece of paper with a slight frown. He held it like it had bitten him. He hadn't refilled his prescription, he said. What prescription? His heart medication. Due 10 days before he died. Never picked up. I took the paper. The name of the drug was familiar. A beta blocker, nothing exotic. The kind that keeps the body from outrunning the soul. He was supposed to be taking it daily. Without it, well, it wasn't inevitable, but it wasn't unlikely. I stared at the paper, folded it, unfolded it again. Julia's alibi had been La Traviata. A line came to me, not from Verdi, but from Euripides. A chorus. Something about the gods granting clarity only after the act, or perhaps I imagined it. The Greeks were fond of hindsight. That night I poured a small measure of Glenlivet and placed the book beside me. I opened it again, slowly. Ran my finger along the phrase, "He who laughs last forgets least." It was too tidy, too literate. The kind of gesture you make when grief isn't enough on its own, when it needs to be seen. And yet, something resisted. I looked again at Selwyn's name on the prescription slip, and then I looked at the space beneath it. Blank. No emergency contact. No second number. Just the name. Sometimes a blank space tells you more than the words. Sometimes it is the only thing that doesn't lie. There are clubs in Oxford older than most countries, but none stranger than the Bacchus. It doesn't advertise. It doesn't recruit. It simply endures, like mildew on stone. Classical scholars with sharp tongues and longer memories gather once a term to drink wine not for pleasure but for ritual, toasting ruins and epithets, disputing translations in a fog of erudition and port. I never liked it. Too clever by half, too proud of its own dust. Selwyn, Julia, and Mallory had all been members, naturally. A trinity of brilliance and condescension, but there had been a fourth, Dr. Ian Venn, whose name hadn't surfaced until the university's alumni registrar, after much rustling and a faint note of scandal in her voice, mentioned the word plagiarism in the year 1997. Venn had vanished into the Cotswolds shortly thereafter, into a cottage with a dry stone wall and a garden he pretended to grow. We found him among the damp ferns and empty wine bottles. He answered the door in a cardigan that had once belonged to a student wardrobe and looked surprised, though not displeased, to see me. Lewis, as always, filled the space with questions. I preferred to wait. We sat in the kitchen, which smelled of lemon balm and quiet resignation. He poured wine without asking, an earthy red with the bitterness of old paper. Eventually, I asked about Selwyn. Dead. Yes, I heard. Didn't like the man. But then I wasn't alone in that. And Julia, he smiled without pleasure. Brilliant, terrifying. They were a pair once. Before it all turned. What turned? He hesitated, or perhaps he aged just slightly. Then he spoke. There was a club dinner. Must have been 89. Julia stood up during the final toast, called him a fraud. In front of Mallory, everyone. Said he'd twisted a translation, something about Euripides. Claimed he did it to suit a theory. She was right, of course. But no one likes being told that in Latin. And what did Selwyn say? He didn't. Just walked out. Quietly. That was his gift. Retreat as punctuation. I asked if the matter ever surfaced again. It hadn't, or if it had been buried beneath tenure and wine. Venn sipped. Then, with the hesitation of someone about to remember too much, he stood and opened a drawer. I got this last week. No note, no return address. Just this. He handed me the parcel. Brown paper, string. Inside, folded thrice and pressed flat, a poem, handwritten, the ink faint, the lines neat. I read it aloud, slowly. The tongue that lies is not the one that burns, but the one that forgets it ever spoke. Lewis glanced at me, uncertain. It's not original, I said. A fragment from Archilochus, badly reworked. But it's something else too. A warning. Venn sat back, eyes unfocused. I thought so, yes. Thought maybe it was from Selwyn, or about him. I asked when it arrived, 3 days before I read of his death. Postmark smudged. London, I think. Couldn't be sure. The poem wasn't a confession. It wasn't even angry. It was deliberate. That was what troubled me. It knew its audience. I asked if Julia might have written it. Venn gave me a look. Not of disbelief, but of complicity. If she did, she had a reason. I tucked the poem into my coat pocket. Outside, the sun had fallen behind a bank of sullen cloud. We stood by the gate. Venn asked if I thought Selwyn had deserved it, whatever it was. I said I didn't know. Then I asked if he had kept anything from that night. The Bacchus Club, the argument. He shook his head. Number. But I remember the silence after. The kind you don't forget. The kind that says more than anything spoken. As we drove back through lanes that stitched the countryside like old handwriting, Lewis asked what the poem meant. I said it was about memory, the kind that doesn't fade. He nodded, but I don't think he understood. The past isn't behind us. It waits ahead, in places we haven't yet learned to regret. There's a particular hour in Oxford when everything loosens. Not in any dramatic fashion. No sudden unraveling of sky or conscience. Just the slow release of restraint. The students quieten. The buses seem gentler. Even the city's ghosts retire to their alcoves and manuscripts. It was some time between whiskey and sleep when I found myself sitting by the window, half listening to the rain strike the glass in broken iambs, and staring at the crossword as though it might explain something. The Times. Thursday. Too clever by half. 27 across. They come for the last laugh. 8. I let the pen hover. The clues that flirt always take the longest. I tried a few false starts. Comedians, clappers, critics. But none of them sang. Then, without real effort, it arrived. Mourners. Of course. I circled the word. Sat back. Let it hang. They come for the last laugh. The phrase itched, not because of what it meant, but because of what it remembered. I thought of the book buried with Selwyn, the Greek inscription, deliberately elegant, but too elegant. He who laughs last forgets least. Julia, with all her surgical precision, wouldn't have misquoted the original. She'd spent half her life teasing out the implications of laughter in ritual, and more than half mastering the weight of words. The line had been misrendered, not enough to alarm a lay reader, but enough to jar a purist. She wouldn't have done that. But someone else might. I rose, pulled Selwyn's lecture notes from where I'd abandoned them beside the record player, flicked through the pages with the distracted care of someone handling a letter from the dead. Near the end, margin scribbled in pencil, not ink, a phrase. We bury what we can't forgive. Different handwriting. Neater, smaller, lacking Selwyn's arrogant flair. I stared at it until the words ceased to register as language, then again until they did. We bury what we can't forgive. I said it aloud, quietly, and suddenly, the will, the daughter, and the burial came together like 3 points in a crooked triangle. Selwyn had left his manuscript, his legacy, to Mallory. Not to Julia, not to Isabel. Julia had received the estate, yes, but nothing personal. Isabel omitted almost entirely, a footnote in grief, a quiet removal. 3 years estranged. She'd said it with a chill. Not we drifted, not we lost touch. He made his choices. The book in the coffin, the quote, the misquote. I closed the lecture notes. Some daughters inherit absence, some become it. The room tilted slightly, not from drink but from the rebalancing of things I hadn't quite named. Outside, a fox screamed somewhere in the gardens, brief and raw, like something startled into honesty. I poured another inch of whiskey and didn't drink it. The crossword sat on the arm of the chair. Mourners. They come for the last laugh. But sometimes, I thought, they bring it with them, and sometimes it's not laughter at all. Just a sound we don't know how to stop. There is a stillness that comes after revelation. Not quiet, not peace. Something colder. A soft cessation of resistance, like the end of rain against a window when the storm has spent itself. I found Isabel walking along the canal path near Port Meadow, wrapped in the kind of coat that asks not to be spoken to. The wind caught the edge of her scarf and dragged it briefly across her mouth, like a silencing. She didn't stop when I fell into step beside her. I didn't ask for permission. I told her what I'd read. The handwriting in the margin. The line that didn't belong in the lecture notes. She didn't deny it. I found his journal, she said. No preamble. The wind tugged at her sleeves, but her voice remained level. It was in the attic. He didn't even hide it. Pages and pages. About mother, about me. About how brilliance wanes in women, how charm expires, how a daughter might be clever, but never quite clever enough. I didn't interrupt. I let her walk, let her find her way through the sentences. He wrote about Julia with this smugness, as if she were an experiment he'd abandoned, and me, as if I'd betrayed him by not becoming him. She stopped, finally. A boat passed, slow, its wake pressing gently against the shore. I confronted him, he laughed, not out of cruelty. That would have been easier. It was worse. It was disbelief, as if none of it mattered. She turned to face me then. No tremor in her hands, no ask for absolution. He wasn't taking his medication. He left it out. Forgot it, maybe. I didn't know what I was going to do when I walked into the room, but there was the bottle, the glass, his usual sherry. I added the pill. Just one. He always had 2. I just replaced the second. She paused, not to compose herself, to let the truth breathe. I left the book on the nightstand, the one with the poem. He used to say words outlive us. I wanted mine to. We walked back in silence. At her door, I said nothing. There are things that do not require naming, things the law, in its rigid liturgy, cannot speak properly to. Later, I found Julia sitting on a bench in the botanic garden beneath the glass-house arch. The scent of late wisteria, that stubborn, spectral bloom, lingered in the air like a memory that didn't know when to leave. She didn't greet me, just tilted her head. "South, you've finished your investigation." I nodded. "He's dead," she said. "Whatever else happened, that part is complete." I told her what I'd learned, the journal, the poem, the glass. She didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't look surprised. "I didn't know," she said quietly. I thought he'd run out of cruelties, but he'd simply learned to whisper them. And the laughter? She smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't ask to be seen. It was relief, not for his death. For the end of the performance, he always had to be the cleverest in the room. Even when he died, he left a script. I just chose not to follow it. I left her there, beneath the aching vines. That night, I finished the crossword. The final clue was a simple one. 8 letters. What remains when the truth is gone? I penciled in silence and let the page fold closed. It was late, but not yet dark. That strange Oxford hour when the sky forgets which season it's meant to belong to. I walked without direction, letting the rhythm of my shoes against the towpath pull me past the colleges, the boat houses, the quiet embankments where scholars once kissed or argued or never said what they meant. The Isis moved slowly beside me, indifferent and brown, carrying reeds and rain and the memories of things lost upstream. She was there, as I suspected she might be. On the third bench from the footbridge, beneath the hornbeam tree whose branches leaned like tired professors. Julia. Sketchbook in hand, scarf trailing like punctuation. Her lines were firm, economic. A riverbank, perhaps, or a face she didn't want to remember. She did not look up. "Did you come to arrest me?" I paused. Not out of hesitation, but respect. "Number, you didn't kill him, but you did bury him long before the funeral." Her pencil stopped, though her head remained bowed. She smiled. Not cruelly, not with defiance. Just a gesture toward something shared and long since past. We stood like that. Her seated, me beside the path. Both of us still, while the swans made their way downstream. Pale shadows on water, unbothered by consequence. They reminded me of letters never posted. The kind we write too late, or too carefully. The kind we reread but never send. I thought of the poem. The one placed beside Selwyn's body like a curse disguised as tribute. I thought of how laughter at a funeral can be an act of mourning, or protest, or simply punctuation. "He was already gone, wasn't he?" I said. Julia's eyes never left the page. He left in pieces. The funeral was just the last of them. I watched her for a moment longer, then looked away, not out of discomfort, but reverence. Some griefs are too private to witness without trespass. She resumed sketching. The world, it seemed, had moved on without needing permission. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the faint scent of wet stone and late spring. A rowing shell passed on the far bank, its oars dipping in rhythm, precise and forgettable. I began to hum, soft and almost thoughtless. Verdi, of course. The familiar ache of Addio del passato. Farewell to the past, the aria that lingers like perfume after a woman has gone. As I turned to leave, Julia said nothing, and Oxford, dear, deceitful Oxford, carried on pretending it never saw a thing. Inspector Morse has walked away. The case is closed, not cleanly, not loudly, but with that quiet ache only he could leave behind. The poem lies in the coffin. The river forgets, and Oxford, as always, remains silent. The end.